Hello, hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 3655. Today's date is October 22, 2025. It's been almost like morning at 9:11 a.m. By the way, last night, yesterday, I haven't really record Artifact. Like I record Artifact in the morning, but I haven't really record Artifact during the night. Couple of reasons, by the way. Yesterday was a Deepavali, so quite and busy. And another thing is that one of my friend is actually getting married. Okay, yeah. Tomorrow, Subodh Pintu is one of my friend who has a getting married tomorrow. And yesterday was Mehendi, so I went there. And today is Haldi. Yeah, so probably I'm very much occupied with this all those kind of like assembly marriage and things like that, so which is really good, really great too. Okay, so let's just continue with the artifact. Whatever the time that I remain, I just kind of like record the artifact. All right. Okay. By the way, happy Deepavali. I don't know who you are, where you are, and when you are kind of like listening this thing. Yesterday was Deepavali. Today is also Deepavali too, but the main festival was yesterday. So happy Deepavali. Okay. And yeah. All right. Let's proceed to the question. Let's go. Okay. Question is, what if French Revolution succeeded completely? Oh, that is a really good question. Okay. All right. First of all, what exactly is this question and why am I asking this question to myself? This is what if question. What exactly is this thing? What if question is a kind of like a really interested way to give the answer. It's kind of like simply force you to think about that reality, create that reality according to the knowledge that I have. Uh Disclaimer. Okay, disclaimer. Okay, it's really essential to give disclaimer. The information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right or is not exactly wrong. Also, the information that I'm trying to tell you is kind of like somebody telling the information that I have till this moment. In the future, I might have more information in my head. So probably is this thing that key I might not agree that whatever I said today in the future I might not agree because I was kind of like a bit really more information that I will gonna get in the future. So don't really rely on that. Okay, it's just my opinion. It's kind of like a simply progress path. Okay, yeah. Like basically you are in the step 5, tomorrow you will be in step 6, step 7, step 8. This kind of like an artifact are letting me to kind of like a simply whatever the knowledge that I have, I'm just trying to give my opinion, a kind of like a simply freedom to express what is actually my opinion. That is all I want. So don't really believe or don't really kind of like a simply think that it's a like a correct thing. Like basically this thing, yeah, yesterday I was kind of like listening my artifact, and I was kind of like a talking about all those kind of like a shit that is so not true. Okay, yeah. So I realized that probably is this thing that it might gonna affect me in the future, so it is really essential me to kind of like give the disclaimer. Okay, yeah, that whatever the stuff that I was gonna saying is not exactly right, is not exactly wrong. It's just kind of like a representing the knowledge that I have till this moment. Till this moment means like that till this 22 October 2025. Okay, this is the kind of like some knowledge that I have. In the future I might have even more information, but okay, so do not kind of like judge me according to the information. Okay, I'm just like this artifact is kind of like letting me to express my opinion, and that's it. Okay, and that's what I want. All right, all right. And if you seek for any kind of like some information, go to the internet, go to the chat gpt, go multiples of ais and research and things like that, and you will get the entire information. I'm just kind of like expressing my opinion. All right, everything cool, great. All right, yeah, let's go, let's proceed now. Regarding about the question says that what if the French Revolution succeeded completely? The one of the first important question is that what is actually French Revolution? Okay, yeah. Not really sure. The French Revolution actually started earlier, or kind of like some American Revolution. I'm not really sure. Okay, what is at least what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, yeah. So our world is kind of like a filled with inequality, rich, poor, casteism system. People are kind of like basically is this thing na, like entire world is kind of like somebody went through that key only one person is kind of like a ruling all around the kind of like a somebody nations and things and that. Okay, previously we have kind of like a somebody a leader of religious person, then after that a leader of empire, right? So this is not something really good. Okay, yeah, we need a kind of like a something such a system where kind of like a somebody their government is actually run by the people, not by the kind of like a one person. So we are kind of like a invented such a step called democracy. In the democracy, people are kind of like a choose a one person who is kind of like a somebody do the work for the people for a limited period of time, and then after that he have to be kind of like a somebody re-elect himself, or kind of like somebody try to say that okay, I did something really good, so elect me again. So this is what kind of like somebody the democracy actually started. Like basically the purpose of democracy is that he give the freedom, give the rights to all the people, not only the people who are elite but as well as every people who are kind of like somebody like a poorer or middle class or things like that. So this is what kind of like a meaning of democracy is. Kind of like a somebody the government is actually run by the people, not by just one person, not by just empire and things like that. Okay, now this idea is kind of like a something like that key seed by the French Revolution. Let me tell you one thing. French Revolution is one of the kind of like assembly, one of the really deadliest historical event in the human history that leads to kind of like assembly really good values to the human today's like basically this thing. Why is this French Revolution happened? What exactly is this thing? And why the only this revolution happened in the French? Why not other part of the world? Well, first of all, okay, yeah, this is actually happened probably maybe I'm not really sure the exact age, but something that 1600 to probably 1400. I'm not really sure. Okay, yeah. So in that period of time, okay, yeah, uh, the the people who are kind of like living in Europe, specifically in France, they are very much literate. Okay, what's the literate means? What literate means like that? Ki they understand writing and they understand reading. Okay, yeah. Now this is kind of like one of the essential factor for human growth and human mindset growth. Okay, to be literate, to be kind of like educated. Now one of the first answer that I have to give is that illiterate. Okay, yeah, because the thought process that humans have, that key we all like basically let's just understand from the people who are actually let's just say that key at the 1500. Okay, let's just say today's date is a kind of like a 22 October 1500. Okay, yeah, like 1500. Okay, yeah. So basically what I was thinking, like what is actually my mentality, what is actually my thought process regarding about the democracy and things like that. Like basically democracy concept is not even exist at that time na. Like basically what I was thinking, that government or any kind of like assembly empire, I always knew that one empire gone, another empire will gonna rise up. So basically is this thing, I have to be work under some certain empire and I cannot control anything at all. Okay, I don't really have any rights or things or that. And whatever I wanted to live my life, like basically as the empire kind of like a suggest me what kind of like a somebody life that I should supposed to be live, I live that life. I would follow the rules. I would kind of like somebody make sure that I would just alive and things like that. Because at that time being alive and being kind of like getting 2 times of food is far more essential than kind of like a finding which government is actually right or wrong. Okay, yeah. So as a kind of like a somebody normal citizen, as a kind of like a normal people who are things like that, ki, dude, I just need my food. Like basically these are kind of like one of the really essential thing do I need as a food. And that's why I'm kind of like a living for that. Why do I supposed to care about the what is actually government and things and that and that? So that's why most of people are kind of like a thinking that way. But soon as we kind of like we started people literating, like as soon as I kind of like started learning stuff, soon as I kind of like we started understanding the worlds and things like that. Because when you are educated, you are not kind of like a learn by yourself, you kind of like a learn by everything. You learn what exactly happened to you, you also understand that what is actually factor, that why are you kind of like facing these problems and things and that and that. Because let me tell you one thing now, as a normal human, it's just human. But having a kind of like a literate person, that means you are kind of like a getting wings to kind of like a fly and things like that. And this is what kind of like a French Revolution actually had happened. Like a this is what kind of like people who are in the French, like basically let me tell you one thing, that ki French is a kind of like a people who are very much literate people. Like if I'm gonna say who is a kind of like a literate country in that period of time, so probably I might gonna say Britain and France. Okay, yeah. So this is what it is. Okay, yeah. Like basically being a literate is kind of like one of the really essential factor to understand that key freedom is kind of like words are exist. Okay, and we are not bound by just kind of like a one person empire and things like that. Okay, we also have a kind of like a make our life much more better way by kind of like a reading a books and kind of like a understanding our rights and kind of like a fight for that. These are kind of like some ideas that came from reading, from kind of like a being literate, being kind of like a educated and things like that. This will not gonna just happen just kind of like a people just kind of like a randomly thoughts came inside of head. No, it's not. Like by the time like basically almost like a 1400 century, printing books are kind of like invented, and because of these books people are kind of like expressing their ideas and thought process regarding about what is actually life and governments and empire and what it should supposed to be. Okay, yeah. So because of this thing, people are kind of like understanding that ki, yeah, we need a freedom, we need a kind of like a somebody that ki a matter for us, matter for our time. Like basically this thing, it's a very basic thing that we are kind of like a thing right now. Like basically this thing na, we are right now in 2025 and we are people are kind of like a so many something that's so much like a normalize that ki having a rights, having kind of like a somebody education and things like that. Because why this is kind of like something so common, because it was actually exist in abundant in all around the world. I'm living in India, India is a free country, I can do whatever I want. Okay, yeah. But this is what exactly thought process this is the what exactly things that I cannot do in the previous 500 year ago or before that. Because I was kind of like a somebody I was kind of like a always have kind of like a surveillance by some sort of things and that. So which is not even possible for me. And another thing is that ki today's world education is far more kind of like a something normalized. Like I can read a book whenever I want, and I went to school and things like that. But 500 year ago, having a school, having an education is called as a luxury. Like basically in today's world, affording a Rolls Royals is equivalent to kind of like getting an education at that time. So this is what it is, this is what kind of like a things what is. Okay, yeah. But the one of the biggest important thing is that the French people who has a very much literate at that time, they kind of like understanding and share their thoughts by the writing and readings and things like that. So that's why people are very much literate, and these are one of the really essential factor for understanding that ki, yes, freedom is exist, yes, democracy will be gonna kind of like something exist, and we could kind of like do the things and stuff like that. So French Revolution is a kind of like changing the thought process regarding about we shouldn't supposed to be kind of like somebody chained by some sort of empire and things like that. A French Revolution is kind of like a represent that we have a choice to kind of like live the life by ourselves. We have a choice that whatever I wanted to do, I can do that thing. This kind of like a choices that gave by the French Revolution. Okay, and this is what kind of like matter for human civilization. It kind of like leads to the democracy, it kind of like leads to the free world, it kind of like leads to the freedoms and things like that. Okay, and this is what kind of like one of the really essential chapter in the human history, that French Revolution is kind of like somebody invented this kind of like a particular methodology that kind of like somebody we should supposed to be free and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. Now if I'm gonna say this thing, is it actually happened so smoothly? It's not actually happened so smoothly. No, nothing really happen at all. Like basically, it's this thing when you try to invent some sort of thing, there is always be a challenge, and probably is this thing that ki you don't know the solutions and stuff like that. Example is this thing that ki when you start running at the beginning, it kind of like is so much painful to run. Like basically all the parts of the all the parts of the organ are kind of like saying this: stop running, stop running, and stop running, and stop running. But you are still running. The pain that you are kind of like somebody facing at that time, it was kind of like so immense and so painful and stuff like that. But when you are kind of like continuously running for almost like years and years, those kind of like a pain will gone, and it became kind of like a very normalized. This is the world that we are living, that the pain that we are not feeling at the moment, because it's just very common. Okay, yeah, democracy is kind of like running very smoothly because we create the systems and stuff like that. But at that time, when the people have this thought process and they wanted to establish this thought process into the real world, they're gonna face a lot of problems and things like that. And because of those problems, French Revolution actually collapsed, because still it's just a beginning. Okay, just the idea is actually kind of like a simply ideas kind of like a simply involved, and kind of like a, we should supposed to be kind of like a be free and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. So this is what kind of like a, like basically I can go into the details regarding about how this thing happened, how this thing happened, how this thing happened, but still is this thing na ki one of the main purpose that I wanted to tell you is what already I explained. Okay, yeah, like this basically there is a lot of stuff happened actually. Okay, one of the most important reason for French Revolution is for kind of like a assembly literate people are so much literate at that time in the France. Okay, yeah. Another thing is that people are kind of like sharing their ideas and thought process. Okay, yeah. And another thing is that the kind of like assembly the empire, like basically at that time Europe is kind of like a filled with lot of empire, like a Britain Empire, French Empire, Portuguese, Spanish Empire. Okay, yeah. Then bottom is Ottoman Empire. Okay, and these are kind of like assembly empire are very 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 strong, because these are kind of like a some assembly empire not just have kind of like assembly just a colony in all around the world. Like a Britain has a bigger colony, they have colony in India, Australia, New Zealand, as well as kind of like a Canada, like a basically almost like a the the sun never set in your Britain Empire. This is what kind of like a true, because almost like a maybe 35 to 40% of the land on the planet, the land is actually covered by the Britain Empire. Then French has a multiple colonies too, like the France has a multiple colonies, and basically some of the colonies in kind of like assembly South America probably, I'm not really sure about that. Okay, yeah. Spanish has a kind of like a multiple colonies in the US, United States. Okay, yeah, in America. Okay, yeah. So basically these are kind of like assembly the empire are really big empire, not only big empire, they are kind of like equipped with a lot of kind of like assembly equipments and kind of like assembly the warfares and modern things and stuff like that. Okay, so basically because of that these are kind of like assembly empire are kind of like a credible enough to kind of like a conquer any kind of like assembly empire. So they always have kind of like assembly very much kind of like assembly in tight spot, that they might think that ki Britain Empire might gonna kind of like assembly conquer us, or Britain kind of like a thing that ki French Empire will gonna conquer us. So though they always kind of like assembly facing a lot of kind of like assembly the problem in everywhere, like they are always thinking that ki these empire will gonna kind of like assembly take control, or this empire kind of like assembly take control. What I'm trying to tell you is this thing in today's world, like basically if any countries wanted to expand their boundaries, they cannot do that. Okay, yeah, if they can do that thing, then probably they will gonna face a lot of issues regarding about the human rights violence and things and that and stuff like that. And like basically this thing in today's world, when you try to expand the boundaries, the country's boundaries, it will not gonna possible. Okay, yeah, it will gonna possible by the mutual understanding, and kind of like both the parties are kind of like understand each other, then you will kind of like expand the boundaries. But still by the force you cannot do that thing. Okay, yeah. But in that particular era, in that like basically 500 to 1000 year ago, this kind of like a very common regarding about that ki if, and as also is this thing na ki bigger continent, bigger country, bigger empire means like that bigger resources. Having bigger resources means like that ki having more rich, and having more rich means like that ki your empire will be become more stronger and things like that. So what I'm trying to tell you, in today's world the countries are bitterly focused on educations and healthcare, and these are kind of like that, these are kind of like a stuff are make sure their countries actually become grow. But these are kind of like a thought process will not arrive at that time. Those people are actually thinking that ki growing their boundaries and things like that, which are kind of like a leads to the kind of like a modernization and kind of like a having a lot more money and things like that. Like one of the really essential factor what they want is that the money. Okay, and the only way that they could get the money is by kind of like somebody conquering another empire and things like that. So that's why most of the empire like Britain, France, Spanish, Portuguese, these are kind of like empire are always bitterly scared regarding about that it might be kind of like these empire kind of like conquer us. By the way, Russian empire is also kind of like somebody really being really stronger and things like that. Okay, yeah. So it is far more difficult for them to kind of like survive and things like that. But at that time this kind of like a French Revolution is kind of like somebody established at that time, and it kind of like somebody leads them to kind of like do this thing. Okay, yeah. but still is this thing, the timing was not really right. Okay, yeah, because at the time when the French Revolution happened, when the French Revolution happened, the king of the France will kind of like assembly had a resign and kind of like assembly established the kind of like assembly a person who is kind of like assembly started democracy and things like that. But this is, as I mentioned, is this thing when you try to invent something, it kind of like a create a lot of problems, and we need a kind of like a stronger system to kind of like a prevent that problem and things like that. But because of this thing, as a democracy, they don't know that what kind of like a problem they are facing, and this is what kind of like a something that because of this problem the French Revolution actually collapsed. Okay, yeah, more specifically is because of that that this democracy world, like basically the French Revolution is kind of like a established this democracy. This democracy is kind of like a lead the people have a rights to kind of like a do all these things and stuff like that. Okay, yeah, now this thought process, Britain doesn't want that this thought process should supposed to be spread in my empire, or same thing happened with the kind of like a simply another empire. Like they also think that this democracy is not should supposed to be good for the influence. Okay, yeah, so because of this thing, another country are kind of like a create some sort of kind of like assembly the riots and kind of like assembly the internal disturbance and things and stuff like that. And because of all those things, there is an unstable environment is actually created in the France, and because of the unstable environment, the kind of like army general Napoleon Bonaparte is kind of like a rise up, and they kind and because of the Napoleon kind of like stop those all those kind of like internal disturbance and things like that. But which it leads to the kind of like a killing the democracy and stuff like that. So that's why the French Revolution is not complete success. Okay, yeah. Now the question is that what if the French Revolution became complete success? Then this would kind of like leads to the kind of like a really kind of like some really good consequences will gonna happen. Okay, yeah. If the French Revolution is actually started early, and if the French Revolution became succeed, then what would be the world? Okay, so first of all is that there are a couple of things will gonna change. First of all is that the France has a kind of like a multiple colonies in all around the world, specifically in Africa and things like that. And in that period of time, slavery was very common. Because of this, democracy might be kind of like a slavery will gonna stop way early. Okay, yeah. Another thing is that the democracies actually rise up is because of the kind of like a literate, is because of the education and things like that. French Revolution kind of like a make sure that this kind of like a education provided all over the empire, which kind of like a leads to the kind of like a French Revolution or French Empire would be kind of like a much more stronger, much more kind of like a innovation we're gonna started. Okay, yeah, might be like a basically the Britain is a kind of like a first country who kind of like a established the industrial revolution. But probably if the French Revolution actually started so early, then probably the industrial revolution will gonna started in the France. Okay, yeah, and more kind of like industrial revolution, and as well as the industrial revolution will gonna started so early, like probably in today's world 1800th century consider as a kind of like industrial revolution started. If the kind of like a French Revolution is kind of like established, might be kind of like 100 year before industrial revolution will gonna started. And because of the industrial revolution started, and because of all those things, probably is this thing na ki it kind of like adds so much value. We might kind of like went 100 year ahead. Okay, like basically the technology that we are using is might be kind of like somebody using backward. Probably we might gonna use technology maybe 100 year ahead of the technology in today's world. This might be kind of like something really happen. Another thing is that now if the French Revolution kind of like somebody established and succeeded, then probably what is going to happen because of the education, because of this industrial revolution and stuff like that, the Britain Empire will become kind of like a loses power. Because of this thing, at that time Britain Empire is kind of like a much more stronger. But because of the French Revolution kind of like a became more stronger, then probably Britain Empire kind of like a loses power and things like that. And because of its loses power and stuff like that, it kind of like a somebody it kind of like a somebody showing the they will not gonna kind of like actually make sure they will not gonna kind of like somebody that key had enough to stable the colonies, their countries and things like that. So they might kind of like somebody give the independence to the rest of the country way early ago, like basically as the India get independence maybe centuries ago, or maybe like a Canada or like a basically Australia, like these are kind of like somebody the things that they will get the independence way early ago. Okay, yeah. When they get the independence way early, then this might kind of like leads to really good consequences because of this thing, that independence, that kind of like assembly, that independence leads to the kind of like a country that what they should supposed to be do. As the France is kind of like a some leading role in kind of like a democracy and kind of like a perform the like a spreading the education and literacy in all around the world and things like that. It kind of like a somebody share their ideas, and those ideas will kind of like accepted by the multiple countries, and they will kind of like a face that they will kind of like simply execute this democracy in their kind of like assembly the countries, and make sure that because of this democracy everyone has a kind of like assembly ideas to shares and things like that. So there is a kind of like a fall of empire, and it would kind of like lead to really even better growth. Okay, yeah. So basically, is this thing what I'm trying to tell you is this thing that if the French Revolution is kind of like a has succeeded completely, then probably it lead to kind of like a some very much big consequences, really good kind of like some consequences. Okay, yeah. I'm not really sure about the World War I, World War II gonna happen or not. It might gonna. I'm not really sure about that, but probably is this thing that a human growth should supposed to be happen maybe like a basically it's just like that 100 year ahead of its time and things like that. So which is kind of like a leads to very good consequences, but still is this thing that all the consequences that actually happen is kind of like a meant for reason. Okay, yeah. Like basically is this thing that if the kind of like a French Revolution actually happened so successfully, then probably is this thing that people might gonna take kind of like this thing as a kind of like opportunity to kind of like somebody cripple their democracy from inside. Like probably is this thing that na ki internal disturbance, corruptions and things like that, these are kind of like concept will gonna arise so early, and this will kind of like lead to the democracy. This will kind of like cripple the democracy from insides and stuff like that, and which is kind of like a happen in today's world too. Like basically India is very big democracy, and in India we have a lot of corruption. Again, not only just India, like basically Russia, China, in every world they have kind of like corruption. These are kind of like a reflection of the democracy and stuff like that, because of the power is actually diluted to the multiple people. So that's why people are kind of like utilize this corruption to kind of like do the works and things like that. So which is kind of like somewhat something is kind of like a problem will gonna occur too. Okay, yeah. As a democracy, as a kind of like so there is no way to kind of like lead the world to the right way. There is no right, there is no wrong. Like basically we are living a life as a kind of like somebody make sure their life that we should supposed to be grow and stuff like that. As a grow, that doesn't means like that we should supposed to invent stuff and stuff like that. It meant to be kind of like a survive and things like that. Nature are always meant to be kind of like a survive and stuff like that. I am not really sure regarding about all those stuff, but regarding about the French Revolution, if the French Revolution actually happened so early and kind of like a being real successful, then it leads to kind of like a really good stuff. But still is this thing that I also believe that kind of like consequences is meant to be happen for a really right reason. Like basically is this thing now everything is actually happening in the world, good or bad or stuff like that. It meant to be happen. It meant to be kind of like somebody that gives you some sort of kind of like somebody the information that if something is actually wrong, then I should supposed to let that thing wrong. And when that let that thing wrong happen, we kind of like learn from that. It's kind of like some is kind of like something is this thing that as a human we actually learn from the consequences, and sometimes some of the consequences is not really good, but still we could kind of like learn from it, and which is somewhat something really good for us. Okay, good for kind of like some human development and things like that. So this is what I'm trying to tell you. Dude, I'm just kind of like talking so fast, like a talk so fast. I don't know why this kind of like information happened so fast. Whatever. This is my thought process regarding about the French Revolution, things like that. Okay, yeah. Also, disclaimer: the information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right, is not exactly wrong. I'm just trying to explain the information that inside of my head I'm trying to explain. I'm just kind of like giving my opinion. All right. This is it, and thank you.